gentlemen, welcome to another session of Toward a Quality of Life. Tonight I'm going to bring you part 2 of my previous lecture, which was on the political psychological ways of seeing, that is to say, how we are disposed by attitude, personality, and temperament as human beings to feel and therefore see and enact our wishes in terms of politics by virtue of our psychology. But before I get to that topic, specifically, I'd like to mention a few items. One is about, again, genetically engineered corn, a subject that you hear me refer to quite often in these lectures. Again, I see some more news come across the wire about what is known sometimes as BT corn, or under the brand name Starlink corn. That would be notations on the big bags of it that are sold at the wholesale level. What I note this week is that representatives from Japan and the United States met in Japan to discuss some of the food trade issues, one of them being Japan's request to know that it could be guaranteed to never receive genetically engineered corn in the corn that it would be getting from the United States. And as it was, this matter was left unresolved by the current conference. You also recall that not too very long ago there was a recall of taco shells by some companies because it was feared that some of the genetically engineered corn had made its way into those tacos, and it is feared that genetically engineered corn could indeed cause allergic reactions in humans, and of course severe allergic reactions can even lead to quick death. As it is, the genetically engineered corn is approved for use with livestock in the United States, and this is enough to be very worrisome to us anyway, even if we don't directly eat the corn, because it's all a matter of chemistry, and if this chemistry is going into animals and animals are going into us, or their products are going into us, it's still a matter of grave concern. And certainly the food source we know as wholesome and pure, as when it's not pesticided, when it's not preserved, but at least before these things happen to it, or in its natural state, our knowledge of it as sources of health and nourishment and development for us is decidedly threatened, and it's such a sad fact to have to know that such beautiful food, natural food that we know about by tradition, and that could be and is so good for us if it's left alone, would be tampered with and made into some kind of new freak of nature, the effects of which we have no idea, and certainly there will be effects, because any time, whether we'll be able to discover them point blankly or in a hurry or later or whatever, because any time a chemistry is slightly different in the body, it's of course going to have a somewhat slightly different effect on us. And the also pitiful part of this whole matter is that the very foodstuff itself cannot just be left alone. It itself is getting engineered, and that which is not genetically engineered is becoming contaminated and cross-pollinated, and thereby contaminated, stored together and contaminated. And this is a very sad and worrisome. I'm not saying to stay awake nights worrying about it, but these are things that should not be allowed to proceed. These are things that are not coming into the public purview enough. These are things that we're not reasoning about together enough. to understand, prevent, and most of all, even understand what they mean to us and how unnecessary they are. We don't need new kinds of food products, and we don't need new kinds of genetic engineering for people. We just need quality of life with what we have by not messing with it, but by preserving it wholesome and pure and good for us. Secondly, I'd like to bring up the most sensitive and sorrowful to think about problem of ANWR, which is the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, which is way up top, the North Pole area, where the big polar bears and kinds of caribou and reindeer and so on are able to roam, and are also kinds of animals which require huge expanses of territory to be able to survive and thrive, and cannot be impeded upon by humans whatsoever, not in small parcels in between or in any way, shape, or form. And those of you who are following some of the items that are being discussed in the candidacies of the two main candidates for president will have heard that the Democratic candidate is against opening up this refuge, which is a sanctuary and a sanctified area for wildlife and nature, the likes of which we rarely almost have anymore. The Democratic candidate is opposed whatsoever to going through this area to try to drill for oil, which is tantamount to a mortal sin against life itself. God in heaven, forget that. Talk about God right here on earth, or forget God, let's talk about nature and the truth and reality and the beauty and the gloriousness of what we have, and the ruinous and barbaric acts we commit as humans when we destroy, stampede, trample upon, and devastate what is pure, holy, and natural, and beautiful, and pristine. The Republican candidate running for president has mentioned, along with his candidate for vice president, how they would plan to open this refuge so that they could go in just presumably small areas that won't cause harm, and try to get domestic oil, especially using the current oil crisis as a reason, quote unquote, to do this. As I said before, there can be no impedance to the grand territory that these gorgeous and splendiferous animals now occupy. And if you want to talk about sin and banality and acts that humans do that are not morally correct, then we can talk about such ignominies as opening the ANWR, or Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. The environment and matters such as these are so grave and so perhaps seemingly circumscribed and relatively immaterial to everyday life as we know it firsthand, but these matters actually mean the world and are vastly more important than most matters we could even imagine. And this would include, when I talk about ANWR, it would also include matters such as trying to manipulate food stuff that is there to keep us whole and healthy just the way it is. We were talking about the beauty and sanctity of natural food, natural reserves, natural animals, natural landscapes, and the impossibility of drilling for oil in any more areas than we are already drilling, and how much we have ruined. And no matter what what kind of drilling you do, though methods have improved, you're always causing harm to the environment, to boot, no matter where you're doing that drilling. And fortunately, states like California have taken great measures to preclude further drilling and further devastation of areas of their coastline and so on. Now, the thing about talking about corn, bioengineered corn, genetically engineered corn, talking about drilling for oil, or what it's like to see roadkill all over the place, or what kind of things we want for our children to have as an environment to live in, or whether we should be dependent on oil, and what kind of other ideas can we have for the way we live, the kind of houses the dwellings we have, the workspaces we have, and so on. We don't really hear about all these kinds of things on television or the media. That's the problem. And the problem really is less than government, more corporations and corporate power. And as a tangential, extremely important piece of information that I'd like to leave impressed on your mind, I will give you these very simple but gruesome and shocking statistics regarding wealth in the country, the amount of wealth held by people. 1% of all the people own 39% of all the wealth. 1% of all the people own 39% of all the wealth. 10% of all the people own 72% of all the wealth. 10% of the people own 72% of all the wealth in the country. And the bottom 40% of income people own 1% of all the wealth. Now, those are some shocking realities. And this is good to keep in mind when we're talking about corporations and their impact on the culture, corporate power, and now onto the topic of political psychological ways of thinking and ways of seeing, part 2, and why it's important to talk about these and to keep some of these other ideas as a backdrop. Also, when we talk about corporations, we've got to think of I'm just thinking of some of the mundane experience that I've had recently of the ways that some of the wealth is being usurped from everyday living circumstances out of balance to the effect of causing hardship or certainly stultifying the possible progress of more even-scale distribution of how people earn and spend money across the spectrum. Recently, I was in the market for a couple of inkjets for a relatively new printer. And when I went to the major supply stores, the franchise chains, the 2 inkjets for just black and white and color were going to cost me $70. Just to put in the ink cartridges to have a few hundred pages out of each for the printer, something that I'd have to use over and over again. Imagine having to pay $70 for 2 inkjets for a printer. Similarly, we know the situation with healthcare, the price of healthcare getting more and more expensive and the benefits that you can use out of healthcare becoming less and less, and the quality and the kind of experience you have having health care becoming less suitable and less satisfactory by far, again as a matter of corporate relationship and corporate control. And recently too, I thought it was curious how Verizon, which is the new telephone service provider in the area, recently having bought up Bell Atlantic, had on its beginning of new business here a strike by the workers, I guess, who were worried about the security of their jobs. I really don't know what the issues were. I wish I did. And the point I'm trying to make is that when I got the bill from Verizon and got their little newsletter in the mail of what events they wanted me to pay attention to, this was after the strike had been resolved and completed, not one word was mentioned about the strike, which certainly would have been the very big news of what I wanted or needed, or what most people should really need to hear from Verizon. And I bring this up with the idea that the things that you need to hear and think about, you know, how crazy it is for a little bit of plastic and some ink to be paying $70 for a couple of pieces like that, and to keep on needing to have that, and to get messages from corporations when the big news is about what they and the workers have come together and agreed upon and what the issues are, to get no mention of that whatsoever, like it doesn't exist. All these things coming under the umbrella of corporate power and control. And nowhere virtually any kind of regular discussions going on of these things amongst ourselves as kind of daily fodder for what we really should be thinking about if we had half a wit about us. Now, in putting all this together, corporate matters, corporate control, psychological and political ways of seeing issues that are extraordinarily germane to our health and welfare, and generally our sense of who we are and our existential sensibility day in and day out. Regarding this, I had talked the last time a lot about sort of the divide, and it's quite noticeable in this era that we're in the year 2000. We're currently in the month of ending the month of October 2000 as I speak, but in this time, and as people are running for the presidency, it's coming into stark relief how much there is a great divide or chasm between what I was describing as the liberal point of view in general philosophic, attitudinal, behavioral terms, and the reactionary point of view, which I wasn't necessarily calling conservative, because a conservative view can be, if it's well formulated and has integrity, can be a very reasonable and reasoned point of view, and not at all necessarily reactionary. However, what has been termed right-wing, reactionary right-wing elements has often been labeled conservative, so loosely we use that term sometimes to mean what I'm calling reactionary. And just as there is reactionary political psychological ways of being to the right, so to speak, of fundamentalism and perhaps religiosity or very puritanical maybe kinds of systems of beliefs, harsh beliefs, strict, severe kinds of consequences believed in as to be meted out to people. Similar to that, there is on the left wing, so to speak, also the reactionary element, and which might hold as its epitome a kind of secularism to a degree, that requires that humans prevail at all costs according to some kind of left-wing prescripted idea, maybe of a rigid communism or a kind of payback for a lot of the wrongs that have been done to people who are poor, people who suffered in prisons, people who suffered with low incomes, people who suffered destitution and prejudice, a kind of alternate rigid reaction against this, which of itself is also quite reactionary and not the true liberal way. So the reactionary is the scripted, harsh, severe, vengeful, narrow, single-minded, one type of view only, not very inclusive of the kinds of views, certainly not dealing with too much paradox wherein many things can be true and contradictory of each other at once, and certainly not expansive with a lot of room for a lot of ideas, and sometimes impositional, that what the reactionary mind or attitude or psychology is believing and thinking will be imposed upon everything else in its path. The liberal view, on the other hand, in pure philosophic terms, is more about a reasoned approach, a less emotional, certainly a less strict, censuring kind of approach, and one that can tolerate contradictory ideas in the ideal, can tolerate paradox, things that are true all at the same time and yet contradict each other. And even while a person of an attitude that is liberal by philosophy, deep down in the persuasion of the personality, may have his or her own beliefs and ideas, they may also be able to tolerate. Tolerance is a very big part of this. Tolerate ideas and views that are very different, not needing or wanting to adopt them as their own, knowing they exist, and being able to go along with them existing and sort of having a non-judgmental attitude, or if a judgmental one, keeping it to oneself. And in this separated dichotomy of persuasions, you have on the liberal side, more or less grossly speaking, an underlying idea that the government or some central kind of communal agency would be responsible to help people to do regulating of things that need to be regulated, and just take care and see that society is running in the ideal, in the idea of perfection, is running as well as might be possible. Of course, we know reaching the ideal versus the real in any kind of situation is far from possible, though that's what we as humans in essence inherently kind of strive for all the time without our really knowing it or thinking about it. I think we've become cynically used to how far away we are from any ideals, but that still implies a kind of struggle towards the ideal, never to be realized, always just to be real. On the other hand, the reactionary person on the more conservative or right kind of side of things might be disposed to very much let corporations do what they do best, let the market take care of it, an expression I hear a lot on common media, and not just let them do as they do, but even enable them to do what they do. And the unfortunate part about that, from a liberal point of view, is that there is so much difficulty already with what corporations are doing, such that what we really need to know and think about and take care of is very far removed from what we are putting our efforts on. and also that the conglomeration of power, we no longer have a laissez-faire economy, we no longer have true competition. Oh, sure enough, there's competition, but it's among blocks of huge domains of power because of concentration of assets and money, and such that the kinds of agendas that we are seeing talked about or being acted out have, again, very little to do with quality of life and the needs and demands for better essence of life for all of us. Rather, they focus more on things that, in the broader scheme of whether life is going to be a good, relating, wholesome event, have no bearing on that whatsoever, and are very trivial in that more fundamental pursuit, which is one that would be to our best advantage. And also, the right kind of reactionary or conservative, what's loosely called conservative view, might believe more in concept of something more like a trickle-down welfare, such that if the powerful and mighty enterprises are enabled to do well, then that would trickle down to the ones that are disadvantaged, but leaves assuming a kind of hierarchical, highly organized, domineering force of control over decisions, concepts, stuff we have to deal with, kind of lifestyle we have, what we use, what we eat, what we wear, where we go, what we do, how we think, have everything to do with that. And imagine what that means when, as I said before, 1% of the people own 39% of the wealth, 10% own 72%, and the bottom 40% own 1% of the wealth. So that certainly ends up being a dictation to people, does it not? And of course, money is power, not just in the trivial sense, it literally is. And where speech requires money today, to have commercials to say good about Campbell's, or to talk about Weight Watchers or salad dressings, or to have the airwaves. Even shows that pretend to have talk formats are really commercial venues for products to get advertised by having people come on and talk about their product. So since having speech requires money, it means that what the money is doing and wanting for its own very singular, specific, trivial, in the bigger scheme of things, motivation to more money and business is what is going to be put in all of the hearts and souls of the context of life that we're living, put in the hearts and souls of all the interpersonal and media and fabric environment of what we are as living people in a society together. And two examples that are going on recently right here in Massachusetts regarding power and money are questions that are going on the ballot in a couple of days, in a few days here, some referenda. One is to have universal health coverage, I believe, in the state of Massachusetts, and a blitz on the side of the forces that would be against this because it doesn't jive with maintaining control and acumen, monetary acumen, from the way the so-called system exists and structure exists right now. Those forces have banded together and are running a massive ad campaign to tell people that it would be stupid to vote yes on this, that it would make our healthcare system more complicated and burdened than it already is now and drive expenses up. But you hear no voices in the media because there's no money on the other side saying how important it could be to have this and why it could work and how it could work and why we should want it. There's an example of the lopsided ways and the kinds of thinking, ideas, and motifs that are going to, themes that will be running through life, if you can even call them that, all because of corporations, money, power, distributions of income, controls, and their existence in the context of our psychological, political ways of seeing with our underlying personality, structures, and philosophies. Also, we have one question about whether greyhound racing should be banned. And again, a blitz being done by the industry to say they've never seen greyhounds mistreated, nothing from the other side. And we've all heard over the years many people come forward and talk about abuses they've witnessed of greyhounds. Many of us have seen the greyhounds who are given up at the end of their use by the tracks, and how broken their bodies are, how used up they are, how arthritic they are, and how difficult it is for them to walk when people take them on as pets, and it's very sad indeed. Nationally, there's a group that's got a name, something to the effect of being
Citizens for Medicare, with a budget to spend of about $50 million.
Funded by pharmaceutical industry to prevent prescription drugs becoming part of Medicare, because that would mean some new kind of pricing structure, pricing and distribution structure, and the sum of all these examples and the theme and thread of what I'm saying is that you're only getting what the conglomeration of corporate power requires for its daily diet and its daily routines, and this definitely does not jive with just a clear, easy, open, breathing, living existence of real and regular and any kinds of things that may come to consciousness as being important to life and how we live it, and conditioning what we do with our lives and how we feel and how we think. Now, back to underlying all of this, in addition to the corporate scheme of things, the kinds of philosophies and attitudes we carry around psychologically as people when we approach what we're going to think about these things, whether we think corporations are good and should be enabled or free to reign at all costs, whether chasing down the dollar and adoring it as the primary ideal in our lives is the end goal, whether there should be no government or little government and no regulation, which leaves open, well, how would so many of the things that need oversight, no matter who does it, with us living as people, we are not going to oversee ourselves. We're going to pollute. We're going to make products that hurt people advertently and inadvertently. We're going to sell foodstuffs that could harm. These are just things that are really going to happen. They're really going to happen. And but wanting that there be no regulatory oversight, some way of us coming together and having a way to ensure some very necessary safeguards. Would be again more towards the reactionary, what's been loosely called conservative, right-wing kind of point of view. On the other hand, as I mentioned, on the left-wing point of view, persons of that philosophic persuasion may decide that the government should be the all-powerful, heavy-handed, and I think that's what particularly is disturbing a lot of people who are on the right today, that government should be extremely heavy-handed and impose and get into people's lives to a degree that truly infringes on personal freedom. Again, a matter of degree and a matter of strictness of interpretation and single-mindedness, and like anything, taking it too far and being based more on emotion and wanting to get back and wanting to equalize at all costs, a kind of reactionaryism has been responsible for a lot of totalitarian governments, as have some of the more right-wing reactionary philosophies as well, versus the liberal that would not want to enable corporations, that would want to put a lot more safeguards in place, restrictions in place, would not want to have money as the all-powerful tool. The money is not speech, speech is speech, and that even if you don't have any money in a democracy, so to speak, or in a republic that's democratic, so to speak, you should be able to speak freely. People shouldn't own the airwaves. You shouldn't have to pay to speak. And corporations should be reeled in, and government certainly would have a role in as much as there are some definitely necessary problems that we are going to encounter minute to minute that need assistance at any point in time, and that their assistance is not going to come from the so-called private sector, and it's certainly not going to come from perpetrators, and we're all perpetrators, not to blame anyone more than anyone else. Another thing that would distinguish the two broad different persuasions would be matters of whether people should receive harsh punishments and be dealt with harshly for their deeds, so that the death penalty would likely be much more favored by the non-liberal than it would be by the liberal. And vengeance in general, or payback, or revenge, or hurt and pain, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, would be much less favored by the liberal than it would be by the reactionary. Even the left-wing reactionary would want vengeance and would want to even up the score, and many, many horrible crimes have been committed, including those of terrorism, on the basis of this kind of left-wing reactionaryism. But there would be another great divide between the two persuasions, whether to execute, whether to be harsh, whether to have mercy and kindness, whether to use reason or whether to be carried away with emotion when things are done wrong. The problem is, as an old poem from England states, the problem is too that reasoning these things out from a liberal point of view, the unfortunate fact is that the so-called justice, and it's not justice to mete out punishment. As I've said before, justice is equity. equity, ultimate equity of all people. That's justice. It's not punishment. That's revenge. Punishment is punishment and revenge. But as the old poem states, and I won't say it I can't remember the poem exactly, but the idea being that the one that really robs at high levels and really causes harm maybe is able to live with great regalia and great import, whereas the common thief or the one that is more destitute or without means and doing what on a scale is relatively small crime gets to take the whole burden of this so-called justice. And that is what the enlightened and more reasoned view has found out time and time again. In fact, that is what great literature has shown us time and time again. Great literature has shown us that all these measures of self-importance and difference among people and being better than people, some being better, some being worse, some being richer, some being poorer, some being self-assignedly more moral and more true, and thereby and also more harsh and more scathing and more willing to go ahead and execute or go ahead and blame or go ahead and treat unkindly. Time and again, the main thing great literature stands for is to show that all of that in the end turns out to be a grand denial and a sham. That when you take the lid off things, when you uncover the truth behind all these life scenarios, you find that the rot is knee-deep across the board, that no one really is behaving better or worse than the next, and that hypocrisy is really the rule of the day. And that is really a main product, a main deliverance of the great literature of the world, that things are not, number one, what they seem for those that are getting the axe, those that are getting whipped to death. Things are not what they seem, and things are also superficially only the kind of way we would want to believe them for those that stand to be more privileged, and that when we uncover behind the scenes, we uncover a lot of shame and a lot of nasty occurrence. So therefore, the liberal persuasion, being of the more reasoning along these kinds of lines, ends up being of a more tolerant and non-judgmental and able to coexist, let every man stand for him or herself. Whereas the more reactionary wants the script to be followed to the letter of the law, may even want to perpetrate that script onto other people, and can't seem to understand how people could hold other points of view, or can't tolerate too well how people could hold other points of view. Another example I think of when I think of this is, for example, the difference between people who despise Bill Clinton and people who like him or could care less about his infamous misdeeds. Those who seem to despise the ground he walks on, it seems to me, cannot understand how somebody could like him or even find him not to be horrible and worthy of the worst fate. Whereas those who like him, or at least can just let him be, understand or could see why somebody might think it's so terrible, but that's not the view they hold, or they can easily put that in abeyance, or personally it just doesn't mean that much to them, even though they're more likely to be able to see how people could have an opposing point of view, and yet not need to make it their own, of course. Another broad discrepancy you'll frequently find is in terms of religion, whereas the liberal may be more likely to not adhere to religion or to certainly hold it more privately and close to the vest and not try to proselytize it, not try to say what other people should do, maybe in suspension about his or her own belief. The reactionary might be certainly more sure, such as people who will tell you that only Jesus can save, for example. What that means, I mean, Jesus is not here to do any kind of saving. He certainly did say some things, if we're to believe history, and we can like those things or not like them, but the insistence that only Jesus could save, and that taking it further, that you must go to Jesus and not just one person, but another person. And sometimes you'll notice people that proselytize that are very not too gracious or in their approach, not too democratic or gracious in how they try to master accomplishing their goals, and certainly have very single-minded goals sometimes. So liberal is more also likely into an assumption, even if they don't specifically hold it in a clear-cut fashion, that we are codependent and coexistent with each other. And that does breed a kind of philosophy and movement towards socialism, that we would take care of each other's needs, provide for each other somehow, do it as a group, that we all need certain things and let's do it together instead of every man for himself. Let's just go grab what we can and slam the door shut. Versus a philosophy on the reactionary right of, I've got mine, now you get yours. Or on the reactionary left, which says, you gave me mine, now I'll give you yours. And perhaps too the liberal would be more prone to never want to profile a person on the basis of race or any other characteristic, whereas people who are more single-minded see threats abounding, other ideas and other kinds of people are threats, believe in doing everything for themselves to protect themselves, would be very much more easy with a concept of profiling. And never stopping to truly reason out what this means, and putting oneself in the shoes of being profiled, to understand by reason how out of the question such a practice would be. Well, we are coming to an end for today's session. And in these two sessions, I've tried to give you an idea of some of the issues, namely that we are in a highly controlled corporate culture, that the things that we spend time, money, effort, life, energy, motivation, meaning, pursuit, lifeblood, life force on are in effect getting increasingly trivial, supercilious, superficial, commercial, inane, redundant, small-minded, that our economy is stilted such that fewer people have more and more people have less, and that's pretty much where we're at, and that things are getting radically expensive even though inflation isn't supposed to exist. Crazy things, the new necessary things, like the inkjets I talked about, that 2 of them that I need constantly would cost $70 together. And in the midst of that, whether we uphold and support a corporate structured society and profiteering at all costs to the environment, to our souls, to our relatedness to each other as human beings, to meaning of life, cuts into who we are psychologically, philosophically, attitudinally as people and personalities, temperamentally, mostly kind of the way we are probably genetically, or, you know, well, some life experiences certainly can change you, but it's kind of dispositions that we have to a degree. Those grossly being the liberal kind of, and I'm saying this philosophically, not using it in the common way it's used politically, and the reactionary, mainly the right wing, so to speak, reactionary, as it's, and sometimes called conservative, though that's not really an appropriate term, and the left wing reactionary, and the chasm, and how these views and attitudes shape up against the backdrop of the context of what we're really living in as a society together. So some explanation of how we are like we are and how this results in what happens to the quality of life we have, to the policies we have. I hate to use words like agenda, but really to the kind of life we have, and what it's going to all be worth. What kind of value, not value of families, but values for life, liberty, each other, good times, fun, knowing each other, talking with each other, letting animals be, having lots of nature, enjoying our jobs, eating food that's good, having leisure time, not working ourselves to the bone, reducing stress, etc., etc., etc. Time has run out for now, and I look forward to talking with you again. Please check for times that I will be performing music. In the edited versions of this show, at the end, I do put those times in as they come up. And thank you for being with me this evening. Godspeed, and look forward to talking to you again. Good night. Waiting on the corner, wonder what to do with time. I want to make you lazy, I gotta make you real. Gotta get across the street, living like a pretty I'm gonna love the sun, I gotta like the rain, I'm gonna love the
and ask the main researchers there. I am really eager for science, and all to that cause, I am here to volunteer myself. You can use me because I want to help science. And for every me that you use, let a baboon go, let a monkey go, let a doggy go, let a kitty go. And anyway, if you want to take care of all the cancer on this earth, it's not cloning and genetic engineering we need. We got to get rid of that carbon monoxide and that radiation and that Roundup and all the chemicals under any